In the house of the Lord this morning. Now, just a test to see how well people are remembering and paying attention. Who can give me a guess as to a general idea of what we're going to be talking about this morning?
Second hand.
Now, we're in Samuel and still talking about David. We're going to be specifically in 1 Samuel and chapter 24 this morning. But before we actually get into the message this morning, well, let's preface what led us up to this point. Now, we're talking about David and Saul this morning. So there's a whole lot when we start looking at David. We could be doing sermons for still quite a while talking about David. And the more I'm starting to do these sermons, the more I'm realizing this is something we need to do more often, is dig back into the Old Testament. We all too often just kind of overlook it. Now, David and Saul didn't really have that great of a relationship. And that's kind of an understatement, to say it mildly. Yes, in the beginning, when we're first really getting presented with David, David comes out and he becomes Saul's champion on the battlefield, slays Goliath, becomes this mighty hero of faith that we all still know and love. Now, after that, David returns to his home. He eventually is brought back into Saul's courts, becomes a harp player for Saul. David and Saul's son Jonathan become lifelong friends. Now, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about David and Jonathan because that's a sermon for another day. And that's a great sermon on friendship and enduring friendship and loving your friends. So it's a good message. But all this sounds really great. Saul begins to hate David. Now, why does Saul begin to hate David? We can look at a few reasons. Some theologians suggest that it is possible part of it is due to the great relationship that David and Jonathan has. Maybe Saul's a bit jealous over Jonathan giving David more attention than his father, kind of idolizing David somewhat. But we are also told now, 1 Samuel chapter 16, which is stepping back just a little bit, David is told he's going to be a king, an anointed king. Saul is still alive at this point. Now, of course, as we understand monarchies and kingships, we know that generally the succession from one king to the next king involves a direct bloodline. In other words, Saul's upset because Saul's still on the throne and another king's being anointed. So his authority is being challenged, and still yet his son is not going to be king so long as David is alive. David is a threat to Saul's kingship. So, Saul attempts to kill David 7 times. So we've got chapter 18, verse 11, then in 18:25, chapter 19, in verses 9 to 10, and then in 11:15, in chapter 20, verses 31 to 33, chapter 23, verse 9, and then again in chapter 23, 25 to 26. Which is putting us right close to where we're starting here in chapter 24. Saul has been pursuing David, chasing him, doing everything he can to kill David. David keeps getting away. Now, of course, Saul is king. And one thing that is often true of kings and rulers is they become prideful. So the more David eludes him, the more angry he gets, because the more that David escapes him, the more he challenges Saul's authority. He's king. Why can't he kill this one man? He's king. Why can't he deal with this one problem? Now, throughout all of this, one thing that you'll notice up through this point, David has ran away. David has dodged. David has avoided. He's willing to let Saul have the offensive, willing to just run away. Now, this is something too that shows that heart of God in David. Because let's stop and think about this. These 7 times that Saul has attempted to kill David, David already has had the proclamation, "You are going to be king." Yet rather than deposing the current king, he's willing to run from him and wait. Seems odd, doesn't it? Now, to take that moment into context, we need to really think. David is a man full of faith in God. He knew God would deliver Goliath into his hand. He's been told, God has said you're going to be king. To a lot of people, all that means is all you have to do is reach out your hand and strike down the current king, and the position is yours. Now that we've addressed that, where we're starting this morning. 1 Samuel chapter 24. Now when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, saying, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of Engedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all of Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. He came to the sheepfolds on the way where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. The men of David said to him, "Behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do with him as you see good to you." Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. It came about afterwards that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. Think about that. Now, at this point, we also know and understand David is a hardened warrior. He kills men. Nothing new to him. Later, after David becomes king, he wants to build the temple, and he's told that he can't build the temple because he is a man of war, a man of conquest, and a man of blood. And that God doesn't want that kind of man to build his temple. But here's that man, that hardened warrior, presented with his enemy. Doesn't kill him. He cuts off a piece of his robe. Alright. But then his conscience bothers him so dearly. A hardened warrior that's used to killing men is bothered by his actions in just taking part of a robe. See, David had a love for God. A great, overwhelming love. He understood that first and greatest commandment, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. Saul was God's anointed king. So when he cut off part of Saul's robe, he had raised his hand against God's anointed.
Right.
Now, he knew he was going to be king someday. But he was not willing to do it himself. He was not willing even though God said, you're going to be king, to defy the fact that God had anointed and chosen Saul as king. Until Saul passed away, David was more than content to allow that kingship to remain with Saul, because that was God's choice. So David was grieved because he felt that he wasn't necessarily striking out against Saul. He felt he was defying God, that he was doing something against God in doing this. Now it came about afterwards that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, "Far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed." David persuaded his men with these words and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose, left the cave, and went on his way. Now afterwards, David arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, saying, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground and prostrated himself. David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men, saying, 'Behold, David seeks to harm you'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord has given you today in my hand in the cave. And some said to kill you, but my eye had pity on you and said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Now my father, indeed see the edge of your robe in my hand, for in that I cut off the edge of your robe and did not kill you. Know and perceive that there is no evil or rebellion in my hands, and I have not sinned against you, though you are lying in wait for my life to take it. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes forth wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel came out? Whom are you pursuing, a dead dog or a single flea? The Lord therefore be judge and decide between you and me, and may he see and plead my case and deliver me from your hand." When David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" Then Saul lifted up his voice and wept, and said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have dealt well with me, while I have dealt wickedly with you. You have declared today that you have done good to me, that the Lord delivered me into your hand, and yet you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safely? May the Lord therefore reward you with good in return for what you have done to me this day. Now behold, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. So now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's household." David swore to Saul, and Saul went to his home, and David and his men went up to the stronghold. Now this marks a change in the relationship between David and Saul. Saul's been pursuing and wanting to kill David. David again shows that he can be a great, powerful man of God. Rather than killing Saul, he shows mercy on him. And then he points out to Saul afterwards. Saul's left the cave. Saul's totally unaware of what's going on. David comes up, "Hey, look, I could have killed you. Got a piece of your robe here. I was in the cave. You're alive. You're alive because I had mercy on you, because God anointed you." Now, the fact that Saul was God's anointed, we know is Saul's saving grace here. We know David was a hardened warrior and killer. If Saul had been a king of another nation, if Saul had just been a chief or a general of the army, had he not been God's anointed and delivered into David's hands, I am without a doubt that the outcome in that cave would have been different. He wouldn't have just went and cut off a piece of Saul's garment. He would have taken his life. But because he was God's anointed, and because David was such a God-fearing man, he has mercy, takes a part of his robe, and then shows him, tells him, I'm not rebellious against you. It's you that's seeking to kill me. Here is your proof. If I'd wanted to kill you, I could have. The only reason you're alive is because you're God's anointed king. I will not be the one that ends your life. Now we can actually flash forward to the end of 1 Samuel. Saul does not die by David's hand. Saul dies in battle. Well, he's actually gravely wounded and asks someone else to finish him off. Now as we start 2 Samuel, that person comes to David thinking he's delivering great news to David. Look, I've killed Saul. You're now king. Boy, did he get a surprise. He didn't get the reward he was expecting. David said, you've raised your hand against God's anointed, therefore you shall surely die. And he has him killed. David knew he was going to be king, but did not want to see Saul dead. He even grieved when Saul died. Now that's a model of something we should also think about. David grieves at Saul's death. How many of us, that if we've had somebody pursuing us, giving us the hardest time of our life, constantly doing things to give us trouble. Now with Saul and David, we can say, Saul's even attempting to kill David. But, you occasionally have those people in your life that are constantly making trouble for you, constantly a roadblock in your path of life, constantly throwing things in your way. Do you go and rend your garments and cover yourself in ash and grieve when they die? David did. Then again, Jesus tells us that you've heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy. Amen. David illustrates that. And that's something that you'll rarely ever hear mentioned, in the fact that David grieved for his enemy's death. David, the psalmist, who writes us plenty of psalms saying, Lord, deliver me from the hands of my enemies. Yet his prime and chief enemy, Saul, he grieves over his death. David could have ended Saul. Most people would say that human nature, when he heard the news of Saul's death, rather than grieving, it would have been, hey, let's celebrate. I'm king now. Everything is mine. I kind of expect sort of maybe breaking out into a Disney musical, that's good to be king. But no, he doesn't. He grieved because he had such reverence for the choices that God made. God anointed Saul. It is true in 1 Samuel 16, it also says that the glory of the Lord departs from Saul. 1 Samuel 16 verse 14. Right after David is anointed king, we're also told that the glory of the Lord has departed from Saul, that it's now resting upon David. Yet David knows that God chose Saul as king. And of course, contextual thing for us to understand, we occasionally lose track of this in the constant changing political world that we live in, where we elect a new leader every 4 to 8 years. We occasionally re-elect them, so we say 8. In the old world, when you had a king, you were king until you died. Now, if you want to look at some of the implications of that, you can look at the War of the Roses, where everybody was constantly killing the king so that they could be king during the time of the Tudors. In the old world, if you were a king, it was a lifelong thing. You didn't just say, okay, let's elect a new one. God had chose Saul as king. So David knew the only way David was going to become king was when Saul died. Even though God had already told David he's going to be king.